She was just a homeless settler girl. Until she found a ring buried in the snow. It fit her perfectly like it had been waiting. What happened next shook the entire frontier. The plains were unforgiving in the winter, not just for the cattle, but for those forgotten by the world. As the frost swept in and swallowed the last trails of fall, the people of Whitestone kept to their own firesides, watching from shuttered windows while the wind howled outside like a wounded spirit. But out past the edge of the town where no fences dared stand, and no roofs cast light, there lived a girl who belonged to no one. Her name had been erased with time. People called her that settler child, as if the term was enough to explain why she wandered the frozen prairie, in patched clothes and barefoot boots, scavenging what the land discarded. She hadn't always been homeless. Once, long ago, she'd known a home with wooden beams and a hearth that crackled with warmth. But a winter fever had taken her mother, and a quiet kind of madness had stolen her father. He walked into the snow one night and didn't walk back. No one in Whitestone took her in, not because they didn't have room, but because kindness on the frontier was a rare currency, often spent only on blood. So the girl built a world out of cast-offs, old tin for shelter, a broken wagon wheel for a table, and for company. A mutt that limped through life beside her with one ear missing and eyes like coals. That morning had been crueler than most. The wind bit deeper, and the snow was soft enough to bury hopes, but not kind enough to soften footsteps. She was foraging near the ridge behind the churchyard, where snow tended to drift and forgotten things tended to surface. It was there while pulling apart a frost-covered nest of twigs and bones that she found it. A glint. A shimmer. Not gold, but something older. The snow around it looked untouched, as if the world had waited for her alone to see it. She reached in with cracked fingers and pulled out a silver ring, cold and perfectly round, set with a smooth black stone that seemed to drink in the light. It was too fine to be out here, too clean. She turned it in her palm, uncertain, almost afraid to believe in something that beautiful dot without thinking. She slid the ring onto her finger. It didn't just fit, it belonged. It settled onto her, hand like it had always waited there, molding against the ridges of her skin as if cast in her image. A warmth spread up her wrist, defying the wind, and in that moment, the sky seemed to hold its breath. The mutt barked once, startled by something unseen, and the girl stood up with snow clinging to her knees, ring glinting beneath the gray sun. Later that night, when she curled up beneath canvas scraps and hay in the abandoned shack near the railroad path, she couldn't stop staring at her hand. The ring didn't shine like jewelry, it pulsed like memory. She didn't know what it meant or why it had been buried there. But she knew one thing with the full weight of instinct. Nothing on the plains happened by accident. And whatever force had brought this ring to her had summoned her to it wasn't done yet. Elsewhere, beyond the ridge and over the hills that shaped the bones of the land, a man rode hard toward Whitestone. His coat was lined with fur, his horse sleek and heavy with travel. In his satchel was a drawing faded and worn of a silver ring with a black stone, and a message. The one who wears it is owed a kingdom. He didn't know who had found it, but he knew the snow had shifted, and he had been hunting that ring for 17 years. The morning after the ring found her, the girl awoke to silence so deep it sounded like a warning. Not the usual hush of frost settling into wood, or wind dragging itself across the land, but something more sacred, more still. The sky wore a pale blue bruise, as if it too had been struck by something unseen. She pulled herself upright. The stiff canvas that shielded her from the worst of the wind now hardened by ice. The dog beside her whimpered once and then fell, quiet, nose twitching toward the north. That was the first sign. She thought little of it until she stepped outside. Tracks, fresh ones. Hoofprints wide and deep. Not from one horse, but 3. Someone had ridden through the edge of her world. While she slept, close enough to breathe her air and brush against her solitude without waking her. The prints led to the slope behind her shack, but didn't circle back. They had arrived and vanished. She bent low, tracing the edge of one print with her finger. Whoever came wasn't a trapper or drifter. The horses had shoes. That meant money and purpose. She turned her hand over again. The ring was still there, nestled on her finger like it had fused to her bone. She had tried, once, to slip it off during the night, more out of fear than discomfort. But it hadn't moved. Not a millimeter. It was as if the ring had chosen her. Not the other way around. Later that day, Whitestone buzzed with noise, though. No one spoke it loud. Sheriff Mallory had been found beaten behind the stable, his badge stuffed in his mouth, and all his bullets left in a neat pile by his feet. No one robbed him. No one took his gun. But someone had made a point. He'd muttered, something in his bloodied haze. Silver ring, wrong hands. Before falling into fevered silence. Word spread like fire under snow, quiet, but fast. Rumors grew teeth. Some said a band of raiders had come to collect an old bounty. Others whispered about a secret buried in the prairie long ago, when the land still belonged to wilder men. The girl watched it all unfold from the shadow of the church's sidewall, where the vicar let her warm her hands on the outer furnace pipes without asking questions. Her eyes scanned the passers-by, watching for someone who didn't belong. But the truth was, no one ever believed she belonged either. That night, someone left food outside her shack. A loaf of cornbread, warm to the touch. No note. Just a strange symbol carved into the top, a crooked star with a ring in the center. She stared at it for a long time, then split it in half and gave the bigger piece to the dog. Even gifts from heaven needed testing. Far across the prairie, in a town whose name no longer appeared on maps. The man in the fur-lined coat rode into a burned-out church. He wasn't alone. 2 others waited there, both armed, both silent. He dismounted, tossed them a small bag of silver, and spread a parchment over a fallen pew. It showed a crude outline of the region, with red ink tracing 3 roads that all led to Whitestone. At the bottom of the parchment was the drawing again. That ring, silver, black stone. The words beneath it were clearer now. Return it to the bloodline. He nodded once toward the tallest of the men, whose face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. Ride in silence. Watch the wind. She will not know what she carries. The man didn't wait for questions. He simply turned back toward the fire and stared into it as if trying to find her reflection in the flames. Back in Whitestone, snow began to fall again, heavier this time. The girl sat with her knees pulled to her chest, the dog curled at her side. She didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Something had shifted in the air. Something ancient, unrelenting, and alive. She didn't know it yet. But the ring had not only bound itself to her, it had awakened something that had slept beneath the plains for years. The girl was no longer a shadow at the edge of town. She had become a beacon, and shadows were moving toward her. 2 days passed in silence, but not the comforting kind. It was a silence heavy with waiting, stretched tight across the land like the skin of a drum. The girl felt it in her bones, in the way the dog growled at the wind, in the way birds know. Longer circled above Whitestone's church steeple. Something watched her now, not openly, not crudely, but with the patience of something ancient and owed. Her world had changed the moment the ring slipped onto her hand, and now the land seemed to respond to her in quiet, cryptic ways. She hadn't gone back to the ridge where she found the ring. Something about it felt sacred, disturbed. Instead, she stayed close to the broken shack, moving only to fetch water from the half-frozen stream. When she washed her face that morning, she saw something strange reflected in the ice. Her eyes, they seemed sharper, deeper, touched by something that hadn't been there before. And the ring, still immovable now, felt warm against her skin, pulsing faintly with each heartbeat. In town, the tension cracked. The preacher had vanished overnight. His horse was still tied at the chapel rail, reins loose and untouched, but there was no sign of him. His Bible was found open to a page that spoke of oaths and forgotten heirs. Beneath it, burned into the wood, was the same crooked star with a ring etched inside it, the same symbol that had been carved into the cornbread. No one dared speak of it openly, but behind doors and under breath, they called it a curse. Others, with trembling voices, began whispering a name that hadn't passed through Whitestone in nearly 20 years. Alderic's ring. They said Alderic had once ruled these parts not with title, but with presence. A settler turned land, baron who built peace through fear and loyalty. His word was law, and his reach stretched beyond Whitestone into the dark forests and wide rivers. They also said he died without an heir, but his ring was never buried with him. It was hidden, somewhere in the snow, waiting for blood to call it home. And now, it had been found. That same day, the girl noticed the man, tall, sharp-shouldered, dressed in a coat stitched with dark threading that shimmered only when the sun caught it. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't shop, didn't rest, didn't blink longer than necessary. He just stood at the edge of town, watching the snow, waiting. She felt his gaze long before she saw his face. He wasn't from Whitestone. He didn't belong. And yet, he didn't seem surprised to see her. She turned quickly and vanished behind the dry goods store, but the ring burned against her skin. It was reacting not with fear, but with warning. That man knew, not just about the ring, but about her. Somehow, he knew who she was before she ever did. That night, while she tried to sleep, a memory surfaced sharp and cold. A dream, maybe, a cabin, firelight flickering on wood, a woman's voice humming a tune she didn't recognize but somehow knew by heart, and a shadow looming just outside the window. The dream twisted, and the shadow reached for her. Just before she woke, the figure whispered a single phrase, one she'd never heard aloud but now felt carved into her spine. "You are Alderic's return." She shot up, gasping, and looked at her hand. The ring was glowing soft, steady, a pale fire. Against the dark, the dog barked suddenly, lunging toward the door of the shack. A faint knock echoed once, twice. Then silence. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Something old had come to find her, and it hadn't come alone at dawn. The town bell rang. Not for prayer, not for gathering, but for burial. Sheriff Mallory was dead this time for real. No wounds, no struggle, just gone. In his clenched fist was a single item, a page torn from the town's founding charter. Soaked in blood, the page had only one word written in thick black ink, underlined 3 times, heir. The girl didn't know what fate had found her, but she knew this. There was no more running. The plains didn't offer escape. They only offered redemption or ruin. And now, the ring had summoned both. The wind carried stories long before people did. And on that bitter morning, Whitestone felt like it was listening again. Dust blew across the streets even though the ground was frozen. And somewhere in the distance, crows circled like they had found something worth watching. The girl had not slept. There were no dreams left, only truths waiting to be faced. She rose from her straw mat, wrapped herself in a blanket stitched from old flour sacks, and stood just outside the door of the shack. The air had changed, not just in temperature, but in weight. A reckoning was close. Words spread fast in towns like Whitestone. Rumors filled cracks like water, froze in place, and shattered everything they touched. By noon, every eye turned toward the girl. The whispers weren't just fear anymore. Some sounded like reverence, some like accusation, and some, especially from the oldest townsfolk, sounded like recognition. People who hadn't looked her in the eye in years now paused to stare, as if seeing something behind her eyes they had forgotten existed. She didn't need to ask what they'd heard. The sheriff was gone. The preacher, too. That stranger in the black-stitched coat still hadn't spoken a word to anyone but yesterday. He'd visited the mayor's widow and left behind a single gold coin, with the Aldrich crest burned deep into its face. No one had seen her since. The girl didn't flinch when a letter was delivered to her shack. No one brought her letters. But there it was pinned to the door with a knife whose handle was carved with the same crooked star. The letter said only this: when the ring returns, the oath must be renewed. At dusk, the well of Aldrich. She didn't know what the well was, but the name Aldrich had clung to her now like breath in cold air, as if the land itself had decided to call her something new. She folded the letter and tucked it into her coat, her fingers grazing the ring as she did. It no longer felt foreign. It felt like skin. She walked out of Whitestone as the sun began to crawl low over the horizon, and not a soul dared follow. They watched the barefoot girl with fire in her eyes and a ring that shimmered like moonlight walk toward a legend no one believed in anymore. The wind picked up, carrying her scent, her steps, her resolve. The dog followed, silent, his one ear flicking at invisible noises. She passed the ridge, past the stream, kept walking until the hills opened into a clearing she had only seen once years ago. When she was still small enough to be carried and loved, the well was there, half buried in snow and thistle, old stone, carved with symbols that time had tried to erase but failed. And as she approached, the stranger was waiting, the man in the black threaded coat. He did not reach for her. He simply stepped aside, revealing a broken stone at the base of the well with a sigil carved deep into its face, a hand, palm up, with a ring etched into the middle finger. The girl stepped forward. Her footsteps made no sound. The dog sat at the edge of the clearing and watched. She placed her hand over the stone. The wind stopped. The world held its breath, and the ring began to glow. Not fire, not light, but memory. The stone cracked down the center, and beneath it was a hollow chamber filled with dust and a single scroll bound in black thread. She pulled it free. The seal bore the name Aldrich and the phrase, in a script that hummed against her skin, to the one who wears the truth. The man in the coat spoke now, for the first time. Only one word: swear. She didn't ask what it meant. She didn't need to. The scroll was a contracta pact written by Aldrich himself long ago, before war and fire buried his name. It named her blood. Not by name, but by mark. A birthmark shaped like a crescent moon hidden just beneath her collarbone. She had never known what it meant until now. She unrolled the scroll, pressed her hand against the oath line, and the ring glowed with heat. The words vanished into her skin. The man bowed his head far across the valley. Bells began to ring in a town that had long forgotten its own founding. The land was shifting. The bloodline had returned, but with it came enemies. For Aldrich had not ruled alone, and not every heir was content to be forgotten. The valley hadn't echoed with bells in nearly 2 decades, not since Aldrich's men had scattered like dust on the wind, and the world quietly agreed to forget him. But now, as the iron sound rolled across the plains, horses stirred in distant stables. Lanterns lit in watchtowers that hadn't seen flames in years. Somewhere deep in the ravines of a canyon, where the sun only touched rock for a few minutes each day, a man sat alone, fingers wrapped around a cracked wine goblet. When the sound reached his ears, he didn't rise. He only smiled. The oath had been renewed, but the girl wasn't alone in the bloodline. Back in Whitestone, the town moved uneasily. They tried to carry on as before. Bakers still needed dough. The blacksmith hammered his iron. The saloon poured drinks, but nothing felt the same. The girl had walked into legend and returned with power stitched into her veins. They could feel it, even if they didn't want to believe it. And still, no one knew what that power meant. She didn't rule them. She hadn't made demands. But something in the land had begun to stir. Grass grew in patches where snow hadn't melted. Birds that hadn't migrated back in years returned to perch on chapel roofs. Even the water from the well behind the general store, once brackish and dry, flowed again. Some called it miracle. Others called it warning. She kept to herself in the days that followed. The man in the coat had vanished after the oath. leaving only a mark carved in the earth where he'd stood. But now, the girl felt the ring pulse at odd hours before rain, before dreams, before fear. It whispered not in words, but in feelings, urgency, change, and danger. One evening, just as the sun fell beneath the hills and shadows stretched long and sharp across the land, a rider came into Whitestone. No one knew his name. He wore gray, leather streaked with crimson, his hair slicked back and his eyes hollow like smoke. He didn't stop for food, didn't speak to the gatekeeper. He simply dismounted in front of the chapel, walked to the mayor's house, and knocked once. By morning, the mayor's house stood empty, the door left open, hearth cold, and a red ring painted on the floor in ash. The girl knew before anyone told her. The dog howled low that night and stood watch by the door, his fur bristled, tail stiff. The girl sat with her hands on her knees, the ring glowing faintly like a storm lantern trapped inside her. She could feel the other now, not just someone who wanted the ring, someone born to it, someone born to destroy her. In the weeks after Aldrich vanished from the world, the legend had split. 2 children twins, they said, had vanished into the snow. One was pure of heart, the other born with fire in his eyes. The councilmen claimed they both died, but the land knew better. And now, the boy who should have been king had returned, not to take back the oath, but to burn it. The girl left her shack that night and walked toward the ridge. The wind cut through her clothes, but she no longer felt the cold. The ring pulsed harder now, like a warning bell inside her chest. At the ridge, she looked down on Whitestone, her birthplace, her battlefield, her burden. Lights glimmered faintly in windows below, but the darkness between them was growing. She could no longer wait for the storm. She had to walk into it. By morning, she would leave for the stone lands, Aldrich's last refuge, carved into the cliffs beyond the river gorge. The oath could not be protected with silence anymore. It had to be defended. It had to be proven. And far off, beyond the horizon, the second heir had already begun his march. He did not want the ring. He wanted revenge. The girl crossed into the stone lands before the frost had lifted. The cliffs rose like giants from the frozen prairie, jagged and silent, worn smooth by wind and time. They stood as sentinels over the final piece of Aldrich's legacy, the place where his bloodline had first been sworn in. Secret. She knew the stories now, not from books or townsfolk, but from the ring itself. It showed her flashes when she slept, a man with fire-colored hair binding his wrist with rope soaked in snowmelt, repeating ancient words over a shallow grave. A pact, a debt, a destiny. She walked alone, save for the dog, whose steps mirrored hers with eerie precision. No roads led here anymore, just faint paths traced in deer prints and wind-worn stone. When she reached the mouth of the ravine, the ring pulsed hot against her finger. A mark in the snow told her she wasn't first to arrive. He had come before her, the second heir. Inside the cavern, she found the fire still warm. He had stood here, perhaps just hours before. A sigil burned into the cavern wall told her his intent, an ancient glyph meaning sever. He had not come to honor the bloodline. He had come to erase it. The girl stepped forward into the dark, deeper into the heart of the stone where the echoes of Aldrich's oath still lingered. The walls narrowed, pressing against her shoulders until she reached the burial slab at the central flat table of gray stone surrounded by unlit lanterns. She placed her hand on the surface, and the ring flared white, sending ripples through the air like smoke underwater. The chamber woke. Behind her, footsteps. She didn't turn. She knew it was him. The other heir stepped into the circle of light, his boots coated in ash. His hair, unlike hers, was straight and dark, tied behind his head with sinew cord. His coat was stitched with bone, and across his chest was a chain made of ring bands, dozens, maybe more, each taken from those who had worn them before. His eyes, when they met hers, were hollow but alive, like coals that hadn't burned out, just waited. He said nothing, just walked to the opposite end of the slab and placed his palm on the stone. For a second, the chamber hesitated. Then light erupted between them, brilliant, blinding, spiraling upward toward the cracked ceiling. A choice had to be made, not by the stone, not by the ring, but by the land itself. Outside, thunder rolled, though no clouds hung overhead. Across the plains, in Whitestone and beyond, wind bent trees in unnatural directions. Lanterns blew out in unison. The old people fell to their knees, whispering Aldrich's name like a prayer. The oath was being judged. Inside the cavern, the light pressed between them like a blade. The boy reached out, grabbing the edge of the stone. The ring on her hand blazed brighter. For a heartbeat, the world paused frozen in judgment. And then the stone cracked not down the center, but between them. One side glowed, one side crumbled. The ring on her hand pulsed once more, then cooled. The other heir staggered back, breath caught in disbelief. He looked down at his hands, now bare, the chain across his chest broken. The rings he had stolen fell to the ground with a sound like falling teeth. He did not scream. He did not fight. He simply dropped to his knees and whispered something only the stone heard. Then, like the oath that had bound him, he vanished into ash and was no more. The girl stood in the silence, trembling, her hands still pressed to the slab. And then the ground beneath her bloomed not with fire, not with ruin, but with green. Grass pushed through snow. Roots cracked stone. Life returned. Whitestone awoke that morning to fields no longer frozen. The river ran clean. Trees bore buds they hadn't in years. And a girl who once slept in broken carts now walked down the center of town, barefoot. The ring glowing faintly like a second sun. No crown on her head. No throne behind her. But every eye lowered when she passed, because now the plains remembered her name, and the land had chosen its queen.